Directed by Saito Kenji and developed by Platinum Games, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is one of the most gamey video games of all time. The game was published in 2013 by Konami, and MGR-R is a spin-off from the prestigious Metal Gear Solid series, meant to bridge the 7-year gap between installments 4 and 5 of the main series. Unlike the stealth action focus of the main series, Revengeance is an action slashing game through and through, and is remembered both for its gameplay and its incredible soundtrack. Revengeance is a fairly short game, coming in at 7 hours on How Long to Beat, and my playthrough on normal took about 4.5 hours, but it was still well received with a Metacritic score of 80 and a user score of 8.2. As the name implies, both if you're familiar with Metal Gear and if you're not, the game story is wonderfully convoluted in that quintessentially video game way. You play as the cyborg Raiden in the near future. To fully explain all the ways history and society are different in the Metal Gear verse requires a university course, but luckily the game places far more emphasis on gameplay than story. What we do need to know to understand the story is that private military companies are commonplace, as are cyborgs, and that Raiden is one of these PM cyborgs hired to protect the president of an African country. That plan goes pear-shaped, and we are introduced to some of the bosses we'll fight later on as Raiden gets rapid, unscheduled surgery. The rest of the game is about opposing Jetstream Sam and company, and thwarting their evil boss's evil plan to make child soldiers. I know I often aggressively abridge the story section in some of my videos and then write the story off by saying something along the lines of, "You don't play it for the story," and that's certainly true for MGR Revengeance. But I'll also not discuss the story deeply here because of how rushed and cut down the game story feels. Raiden fights cyborgs for hire in exotic locations across the world and cuts down one of Jetstream Sam's crew, interrupted by codec conversations intended to add context and characterization. The villain of the piece, Senator Armstrong, is great, and the voice acting is solid. But the game's ambient level of absurdity makes its detour into philosophical discussions about individuality feel mismatched. It sometimes also has a problem of being really funny unintentionally. Don't get me wrong, the game is also often funny intentionally, but lines like this,
It could require more than 30 minutes to get to Pakistan.
and this,
It's really more brain storage and maintenance than a server room.
are almost Monty Python levels of absurdity, and they are not much better in context. There's also contrivances like having the one rocket which could get Raiden from Denver to Pakistan in less than an hour conveniently located a short drive away from Denver when Raiden has a 3-hour time limit to get to Pakistan. And again, the plot hinges on Raiden having exactly 3 hours to get from the US to Pakistan, which he would have been able to do if not for having a dramatic sunset sword duel with a Brazilian cyborg ninja. It's ridiculous, which is an acquired taste. The main issue with the story is that there's not enough time to develop the characters, arcs, and plot, which means that Raiden is rushed from big important moment to big important moment without enough context and setup for the story to feel satisfying. The only part of the story which really works for me is the game's bad guy, Senator Armstrong, who is larger than life and charismatic enough to be a joy whenever he is on screen. Like with the story, the gameplay also feels rushed. I don't mean that the game feel is bad or that it lacks in mechanics. The skeleton of the game is really good, but rather that a lot of the planned levels are incomplete. The game sets up the expectation of what a level is supposed to be in the first level after the tutorial, where Raiden fights his way through a variety of enemies, concluding with a big, unique boss fight. However, towards the end of the game, it deviates from that formula when there is a level without a boss, and then a boss without a level back to back. To be clear, what is in the game is very good, but combined with how rushed the story feels, one gets the impression that the development time and budget didn't allow the team to do as much as they wanted to. The game needs both levels and boss fights though, as they provide different mechanical challenges in a mechanics-first game. Imagine how disappointing it would have been if there were no bosses in Anor Londo, or if you fought Calamity Ganon without getting to set foot in Hyrule Castle, and you get an idea of why some of the later levels and boss fights feel wrong. Again, not mechanically, but pacing-wise. The mechanics in Revengeance are those of third-person hack-and-slash action, with a few twists. First, Raiden can block most attacks by pressing attack and a direction at the same time, And secondly, there is a precision cutting mode which is used as a sort of minigame where if you bisect your enemies at the correct place, you get a health top up. Combining the high octane action of fighting several enemies whose attacks you need to block with strategically using the slow-mo cutting mode to finish off enemies and heal is great, and the combat has a different rhythm to it than I have seen anywhere else. But as is so often the case in skill-based action games, the real highlight are the bosses. The game is high intensity, both when fighting many chump enemies and when fighting its bosses, and the bosses feel distinct and often climactic. They have different abilities and styles. Some use trash mobs, some don't. Some are primarily hard to hit, whilst others primarily hit hard, etc. The bosses are in short great, and there's an animalistic joy to getting to Juliana boss after dying to it several times. The best boss is the final one, Senator Armstrong, where the game ups everything to 11. The difficulty, the humor, the ridiculousness, and the visuals of the fight is a step above all the others, and it places in FromSoft levels of boss perfection to me. Speaking of perfection, as any skill-based game should, MGRR has a scoring system which gives the levels and fights some added replayability. Sure, I beat the level, but the overall score was nowhere near an S, so there are reasons to try again. That system is perilously close to being grating for me. The aforementioned rushedness of the game and the short overall length could make the game asking you to replay it to reach a new high score feel cheap. I usually don't care much about scores, and I didn't when playing this either, but I do think it's a weakness of the game to expect you to replay it in that way. Metal Gear Rising Revengeance then is a bit of a mixed bag. Great at points, but an acquired taste. You need a high tolerance for video game bullshit, an interest in skill-based play with an eye towards high score chasing, and a durable keyboard to fully enjoy the game. When the game tries to go beyond its absurd premise and world to discuss individuality, it doesn't feel earned to me. It's hard to take the philosophical debate between edgelord, cyborg, ninja, and cartoon character wrestling politician seriously. The game is, I think, trying to say that individuality is good, as is using your specific skills to help, but that individualism can be corrupted into antisocial auto-elitism if it goes unchecked, which is a good moral. Just wish the game spent enough time with those ideas to develop them into something more than the cliff notes of a philosophy guest lecture. The game is at its best when you engage with it as a set of mechanical challenges rather than as a narrative, and while it's genuinely fun in that turn your brain off kind of way, it never really rises above that to me. What does elevate a lot of it is its incredible soundtrack, filled with fast and digitally infused metal. The tracks, The Only Thing I Know for Real and It Has to Be This Way, are particular standouts which take the respective bosses, Jetstream Sam and Senator Armstrong, up a notch. But music alone is not enough to save the game for me. Metal Gear Rising Revengeance looks and sounds like what gaming is portrayed as in an Adam Sandler movie, and while it's enjoyable and it tries to gesture at being more than that, the rush story and levels mean that it never really grows beyond that for me. What you get is exactly what you would expect from a game called Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. Nothing less and nothing more.